Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
So welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. The rapid progression in artificial intelligence capabilities has far-reaching impacts. It has the potential to significantly boost economic productivity, disrupt labor markets, and alter the balance of power between countries. The widespread diffusion of this general-purpose technology presents significant governance challenges that are amplified by the ongoing geopolitical competition for AI dominance. So this is the background with which we sort of hope to have this discussion today. I'm Sridhar Krishna, your host, and I'm part of the high-tech and geopolitics team at the Takshashila Institution. We at the Takshashila Institution have been writing about AI, the geopolitics around AI, and on AI governance. But we have a very special guest today to discuss how the corporate sector looks at AI governance and if there's a case for increased state involvement. Please welcome Ray Eitel Porter to our show.
Thank you.
Ray is an AI expert and the best-selling author of Governing the Machine, How to Navigate the Risks of AI and Unlock Its True Potential, which was published by Bloomsbury in this year. He's a senior research associate for responsible AI at the intellectual forum Jesus College, Cambridge, and has led AI research collaborations with Stanford, MIT, the Alan Turing Institute, and the Institute for AI Ethics at Oxford University. Ray was Accenture's global lead for responsible AI and designed Accenture's AI compliance program. He advises on principles in policy, governance, areas of risk, such as bias, explainability, reliability, and sustainability, controls, capabilities, and supporting platforms and technologies. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you very much, Sridhar. I'm delighted to be here.
And so, Ray, let's just dive right into it. The most recent thing that you've been doing is having written this book. As you mentioned to me a while back, you retired from Accenture a year and a half ago, and but you've been furiously at work during that time. So, but why did you and your co-authors write this book, and why now? Why was it important for this book to be out in the public domain at this point?
So, I've been working in the space of what we might call responsible AI. What I've seen over that period of time is the capability of AI increasing, but also the risks that go with it increasing as well. And what that has led to, I think, is a nervousness on the part of organizations. So this is corporations, but it's also, non-for-profit organizations, education, other areas. A nervousness about using the technology because they're afraid that it will go wrong in some way.
Yeah.
And that is when I really sort of started to think, well, I've been helping companies to address this issue for quite a few years. And if I look at the market, there was no book on the marketplace that really described from start to finish, how do you set up a practical framework that will allow you to put in place the questions, the controls, the safeguards to give you the comfort that if you're using AI, actually it will be used in a safe and responsible way and it will deliver the results that you intend it to. And so that's really the reason for putting out the book at the time that we did.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I saw that your book is sort of broken up into 4 sections. You talk about the history of AI. You talk about, how should companies set it up? What are ideas for what the government's doing and the path forward. I also saw that the book had a bunch of not just broad ideas about AI governance and philosophical discussions on it, but they were much more practical. And actually, you make frameworks and you put tables. You even discuss about how the organization should be structured in order to deploy AI governance at scale. So you want to tell us a little bit about it? Who is this book meant for? how does one read this book? It's not easy to read. I mean, it's like, in the sense, it's a book. It's not meant for, let's say, a layperson, right? It's really the way I look at it is like, but it's a very interesting book, and it's a very compelling read. So who is this book meant for, and what's the best way to read it, and how does one use this book?
So the way that I typically describe it is, imagine that you're a senior executive in a business and the CEO turns to you and says, we need to do more with AI in the business, but we also have to be really careful that it delivers as intended and that it doesn't harm our reputation and so on. I'm counting on you to set up a governance process in the company to make sure that we can use AI safely and responsibly. And you're looking at the CEO thinking, well, I really don't know where to start. How would I go about doing that? Well, this book is the handbook, the blueprint, if you like, that you could turn to. And if you start sort of at the beginning and you work your way through it, it would guide you in the steps that you need to execute. So it's aimed for any sort of middle manager or senior leader in an organization. They can come from different parts of the organization. So it's critical that as part of developing a governance program, you have to involve technical people. You need legal people. You're going to want HR. You'll want procurement. You'll want a range of different people. So any one of those could be a candidate for reading the book. And it aims to cover both the sort of softer side of things, so the accountabilities, the risk assessment questions and things like this. But it also does have a section on technical tooling. And that's the reason that I teamed up with Paul Donger as a co-author, because he has a PhD in artificial intelligence and is deeply technical. And so he wrote those chapters that go into more of the tools and the technical approaches. And it also has a section on the laws and regulations. And that, again, was my reason for teaming up there with Miriam Vogel, who's a qualified lawyer by background, also based in the US. So she brought a US angle to things, which is useful.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you got two other people who complement the skills that you bring to the book. And so how is it? I mean, how do three people get together and write a book? I mean, do you decide, like, you take this section, I'll take this section, or do you look at each section with different lenses based on your experience? So how do three people write a book?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic to discuss, actually. So, I mean, I started writing the book on my own. And after a couple of months or something, it became clear to me that although I understand the area of the technology and I understand the law, I'm not a PhD data scientist. I'm not a qualified lawyer. And if I was going to actually write things down black and white in a book on these topics, I really wanted somebody who was more qualified than me to talk about those particular areas. But I was also very keen that the book read as one continual book, yes, and not be named chapters, which is perfectly valid. Some people write a book which is a compendium of individual chapters written by different people. That's right, valid as an approach. But I thought, no, I'd rather have a book that people can kind of read and feel like it's coming with one voice. So what we did was we did split up the chapters, and I wrote kind of a bit more than half, I guess. And then the other two authors wrote particular chapters on their areas. But then I took on the role of trying to sort of make sure that the tone and the voice was similar all the way through by kind of reviewing and editing. But also, very importantly, Paul and Miriam, they reviewed everything that I wrote and that each other wrote, because they're experts broadly in the space. Mm-hmm. And without a doubt, that process of collaborating, brainstorming, politely critiquing each other's work, that definitely produced a better product at the end of the day. And a more enjoyable writing process, to be honest, as well.
Oh, yes, I think so, because writing can be very lonely, right? I mean, you just sit alone in one place and you just write and you're never satisfied with what you've done. And having somebody else saying, hey, this is good enough, I think we can move forward to the next bit, I think sometimes is required. Otherwise, you can get caught up in just trying to make that little 10 pages that you've written, read better. But one thing I do agree with you. I think it does. When I read the book, I found that it didn't feel like multiple people had written it. It felt like there was one voice right through. So I think you've got that. You've got that down.
Good.
Right?
Well, I'm glad to have that independent validation.
Yeah, but I'm not a completely unbiased person, right? I mean, we used to work together, Ray. I mean, you were my supervisor when I was at the London office for a few years. And so tell us about your career. I mean, how did you sort of get into, I think I might know some of it, but I think why don't you tell our listeners,
Mm.
I mean, today everybody's talking about artificial intelligence. So how did you sort of get into this space to a level where you were leading the practice for UK and Ireland, and then like you went on to look at as a global leader for the responsible AI practice for Accenture, and so tell us about your career. What did you do to sort of get to where you are?
Well, I guess my career for most of the career has been in some way at the sort of interface between technology and consulting or technology and business. I've always been fascinated by how businesses and organizations and individuals personally can use technology to do things better. It's just always been a personal kind of interest. I play around with the technologies myself and I find them fascinating. And probably about 15 years ago, 18 years ago or something or other, I have been working in a different field for a bit and also applying technologies, but not directly in the sort of data and AI space. And I came across an opportunity to move back into specifically consulting around data. And it wasn't called AI in those days, it was data and analytics. And I thought this sounds really interesting, that the capabilities have really improved in that space, both technical capabilities and data and storage and processing. All of these have come together to really enable us to do a lot more with data analytics than we could previously. So I moved into the space of sort of data analytics and was working in that space for quite a few years, both with another company called Opera Solutions and then with Accenture. And it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, that I started to get interested in the topic of responsible AI or AI governance, because we were noticing, I guess, two main areas of concern initially. One was privacy, the use of data and personal data, etc., in a way that wasn't, treating people properly or respecting their permissions. And then the other area was bias. We were starting to notice that algorithms being trained on historical data, if the historical data had bias in it, those algorithms would perpetuate or even accentuate the bias in the historical algorithms. And so there grew up a sort of branch of the data and analytics world that started really looking at these problem areas and thinking about, well, how do we use AI without these being an issue? And then as AI itself became more capable, more risk areas started to emerge. And, we encompass those within the practice that people have come to call responsible AI. And in order to implement responsible approaches to AI, you need AI governance. And I think that's where most companies are, or most organizations are today. They know they want to do the right thing. The question is, how do you do it? How do you actually implement it in the organization?
Yeah. And I think having those years of experience behind you and doing it starting from simple data analytics and then moving on to machine learning and then all the AI that's going on today puts you in a unique place to be able to now talk about AI governance, right? Unlike some younger people who might be setting up interesting AI companies, but they may not be may not have that experience which helps them to think deeply about what could go wrong, how could things go wrong, etc. And having that knowledge probably helps you to sort of do this more effectively.
I think you're right. I do sometimes have the feeling that I'm always the person in the room who's looking for the negative side of things, the risks and what could go wrong. And I do really like to emphasize the fact that I am a strong believer in the positive capabilities of AI. It can do fantastic things. We just have to be careful in, how we use it. I don't think it's only people with more experience who can work and be very effective in the space. There's plenty of room for new people to enter the field. And that's one thing that I find actually incredibly encouraging is the number of people earlier in their careers who are getting involved in the field, who are absolutely passionate about it, and I get lots of reach outs from people, wanting to get involved and so on. And I think that's really, really positive.
So even in your book, I think you mentioned John McCarthy, a mathematician who coined the name artificial intelligence. And I think that was 1956? Yeah.
Correct.
But then, I mean, if you think that 70 years ago, if somebody had coined the word artificial intelligence and had started working on it, what is it that made the world take so long to get to where we are? And I've read about there were multiple what people called AI winters in between when not much progress was made. So what was the reason for that? And there was a lot of hype, and then there was an AI winter, and then so what was the reason for that, and why is it different today? I mean, do you think this time around we might actually be on the cusp of significant change through AI, or is there a possibility that we might drift into another AI winter in a few years?
So this is, it's an interesting topic. And actually, although the term artificial intelligence was only coined in 1956 by John McCarthy, if you go back to Alan Turing, he wrote about what he called thinking machines long before John McCarthy. And so the concepts were sort of being thought about. So one of the key things that's changed is the availability of enough computing power at a reasonable price to execute a lot of the approaches. So my co-author, Dr. Paul Donger, for example, will probably come on and talk about AI agents at some point in this conversation in a minute. But AI agents are all the rage at the moment. Paul actually wrote his PhD about AI agents in the 1990s. Now, in the 1990s, AI agents were purely theoretical. You couldn't build them and do them, as it were, because we didn't have the computing power to do it. We didn't have the data. We didn't have the infrastructure and so on. So a key thing that has changed has been the technology availability, which is allowing us to develop new types of AI. The availability of lots of data to train the AI is another thing, because AI requires data. And if you go back to John McCarthy's day, that would have meant people typing stuff into a machine manually to create data to train a machine. Now, because of the internet, we have digital data all around us all the time. So there are vast amounts of digital data that can be used for training purposes. So those are two key components. And then it's fair to say that there have also been some breakthroughs in methodology. So things like the transformer architecture, which was initially discovered by people at Google and has now been picked up as the basis for most LLM architecture. OpenAI use it and so on. And that transformer architecture was new in its approach. So it's really a combination of those three things: the computing power, the data availability, and some breakthroughs in new methodologies.
Yeah, I was also reading about that. When you talked about Google, I remembered there was this very interesting paper, and I think you mentioned that in your book as well. It's called "Attention is All You Need." There's a very interesting title for that paper where they've talked about this about this transformer architecture, and I think it was this gentleman Ashish Vaswani and a bunch of others who sort of wrote that paper. So what actually, you want to give me a little bit more about this transformer architecture and what might have sort of changed with that? What actually, give me a little bit more to some of our more technically inclined audience to know a bit more about that.
So I think of AI in, let's call it 2.5 main buckets or categories. So the first is what I call traditional AI. So traditional AI would be machine learning, what we called data science before. So there's a wide range of different techniques which exist in that area, but these techniques are all focused on taking large amounts of data and trying to spot patterns in the data. And depending on the type of data, the type of patterns, etc., you may use a range of different techniques. And some techniques are slightly more explainable than others, but they all rely on models which will learn from the data and find hidden patterns. And those patterns might be numerical patterns, they might be images in a series of images, and so on. And then you move on to what we call generative AI. Generative AI is different because although it also is trained on large amounts of historical data, it actually generates new stuff. So that's the key difference.
Stuff that didn't exist before. It's not
exactly.
They're just
Something
not taking. It didn't exist before. Yeah,
exactly. They're not just extrapolating a pattern, but they're saying based on this pattern that we're sort of extrapolating, we're going to create something new, and that new might be text, might be writing text, or it might be an image, or it might be video or something. But it is actually creating something kind of out of nothing, if you like, but obviously based on its training data. And then the third area of activity is my half an area, which is AI agents. And the reason I call that a half is because actually agents use generative AI and they use traditional AI. So they're not a whole new kind of type of AI. But the key differentiation with agents is that they are able to execute tasks. They're actually able to carry out things. So if you imagine, let's take a question you might put into a ChatGPT or a Claude or whatever, and you ask it for a recommendation of where to go on vacation based on a bunch of criteria that you put in, and it will come back and say to you, well, I would recommend that you take this vacation. Here are some options, and these are possible hotels, and so on. The difference with an AI agent is if it has the permissions, it could then go off and actually book those things for you, either entirely autonomously, or potentially it could make the booking and come back to you and say, approve the credit card transaction before I finalize the booking. So those are the ways in which AI techniques, if you like, have evolved over the last years.
that was wonderful, and it's mind-boggling in some sense about compared to what we could do with data and analytics even 10 years ago versus what you're able to do today, and what kind of access that it seems to have. It's also democratized it in a way that a large number of people are playing with it and trying to do things with it and so on. So we'll take a short break, but after the break, we'll come back and we'll try and discuss what can AI do today and what do you think it can do in the future? So welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about the history of AI. How did it evolve to where it is today? What are the various things around data, on technology, on those models, the kind of approaches using transformer architecture and so on, which sort of all got together, and with a large amount of compute also being available at a reasonable price, how today's AI is now possible, and it was not possible maybe a decade ago, right? But I, along with a colleague, wrote a paper earlier this year on AI, think tasks, not jobs. And I then talked about how even though technology may be reasonably mature and capable, AI diffusion might take some time, and it'll also take place at differing rates across different sectors, different types of work. And it depends on a bunch of things. Like, I look at it like a funnel and I say, here, let's take a list of all the things that AI can do, put it in the funnel, and then look at it and say, how mature is this? Then have a assessment based on how mature is this technology, and is the return on investment adequate for us to sort of, it makes business sense to sort of move to the next level. Then you look at explainability and harm, and you look at, is there potential for harm? And some things you want to be well explained. I mean, you don't want, even if it's not harmful, if it can't be explained, I mean, you still are going to be hesitant about using it. But if something is explainable, at the same time, the potential for harm is low, then you're likely to deploy it. And then there are, even after all that, you might still have other implementation barriers, like you could have political reasons for deciding that, hey, I mean, this is an area in which I don't want AI to be there. I'm not comfortable with it, I just don't want it. Or there are a large number of people in your particular region who might be employed, who might suddenly find themselves displaced, and you don't want that kind of mass displacement very quickly. So there are other reasons why things don't happen. So what is it in your mind that, AI can do today? And what do you think are the areas which are ripe for AI deployment, and there are some, and which areas do you think will take a little more time?
So, I mean, one area that I think has huge potential is the application of AI in science. So I'm thinking of healthcare, for example, breakthrough medicines and so on, because the constraints in that space are very often about how do we process vast amounts of data? How do we understand huge amounts of data, be it data about the human body or about clinical trial results and so forth? And AI, is just really, really good at doing that. We've seen it crack protein folding and things like this, and massive advances I think we can still expect in medicines. So that's one area. If we move into the more sort of day-to-day or semi-automating, depending on how far you feel comfortable going, and I think that we will see a large amount of routine administrative type processes automated, be that at home or be it in the workplace. And typically, those are not the parts of people's jobs that they find most interesting. I mean, that is the entire job for some people, and that will be challenging. But to your point about tasks and splitting, work down into tasks, I think many people's jobs comprise some tasks which are admin type tasks and some tasks which are other things. And I think we'll see an increasing use of AI to try to automate away the sort of routine admin things, and hopefully that will allow people to focus on the more intellectually difficult, stimulating, interesting parts of their tasks. I think we shouldn't sugarcoat it. I think that will overall result in a reduction in work in certain areas. There's this question about, well, will new jobs be created at a fast enough rate to absorb the jobs that are lost? And I don't think it'll be whole jobs necessarily that are lost, but if you imagine that you lose 30% of a job, well, if you lose that across a number of people, it means you need less people to do that, to work in that department, let's say. I'm not sure. I am concerned that this general purpose technology may be different from others because of because the fact that it encroaches on the intellectual domain, which previously wasn't the case, or general purpose technologies in the past took away manual tasks and people typically moved up the chain, as it were, to do more intellectual cognitive tasks. Given that AI comes in and takes away those things, I think that is more concerning for the future of work. But I think those are the two areas, science and automation of administrative type tasks, where we'll see the most immediate impact.
Yeah, I think it's something that everybody is concerned about. While there is excitement around what AI can do, there is also the concern that, hey, I mean, it might do a great deal. It might improve productivity for the organizations for which we work. But then, I mean, why do I care if at the end of that, it means that I'm going to be without a job, right? So I think that's something that people are thinking a lot about. But you can't fight technology, can you? I mean, at the end of the day, the technology is going to develop, it's going to evolve, and you've got to make sure that you're somebody who's adapted it and who's leading the change rather than someone who's being swept away by the change, right? So I think
that's really important. If we just make a comparison, if you imagine going back to the 80s and the 90s when PCs first came along, right? If you had been somebody who said, I'm not going to use a PC in my work at all, well, there wouldn't be many jobs left for you today that you could do, right? Because I can't imagine, of course, there are a few jobs today that don't use a PC at all. But actually, the vast majority of jobs, a farmer uses a PC in many cases to help analyze crop yields and things like this, jobs where you might not have expected the PC to become part of the toolkit. So I totally agree with you. I think it's absolutely critical that people, both old and young, embrace the new technology and think about how can I use it to do my job better? How can I learn this and how can I upskill? I think it's critical that employers provide real training. And I don't mean by that a half-hour video that, somebody can watch if they feel like it. I mean a proper training to help people really understand a bit more about how this works and also how it's relevant to their job. I was at a conference couple of weeks ago in New York at the AI Summit giving a talk, and I listened to a panel by some other people, and the CIO of Paramount, the big movie studio, was talking about their implementation of Microsoft Copilot. And he said, we thought we did everything right. He said, we rolled it out carefully, gradually. He said, we provided online training for everybody, and we just didn't see the uptake. And he said it was only when we actually went and sat down with the different business departments and understood what they do in their day-to-day jobs and actually helped them to see how they could use Copilot to do the things that they were doing. Then he said we saw big uptake, a lot more comfort with using it, because people were struggling to translate the technology into their domain. And I think that is incumbent on employers to really sit down and work with people to help them understand how it can help them in their jobs.
Yeah. I remember, Ray, that, one thing that you mentioned here sort of got me thinking. I remember when we were trying to do digital transformation for organizations in between, say, 2015, 2012, 2015, 2017, and so on. At that time, you found that the biggest value that companies got was initially you're just trying to take existing tasks and try to do it use digital in order to be more efficient in deploying that. But the real changes happen when you realize that digital can do so many things in a particular way. So the way you do the work itself needs to change. The organization needs to transform itself, there needs to be a different organization structure in order to truly get the benefit of a digital transformation. Otherwise, you just take some small places and optimize those pieces, but the organization doesn't benefit overall because there are bottlenecks elsewhere which sort of prevent it from getting to the next stage. So do you see something like that with AI as well, in terms of organizations having to reinvent themselves and if you will, and try to use AI more, in order to take the best of what AI has to offer? Organizations need to change quite dramatically. Do you see that?
I totally agree. Totally agree with you, Sridhar. Yes. I would say that it's not a bad idea to experiment first in one or two pockets in smaller areas. I think it's unreasonable for many organizations to say, well, we're going to go straight in and we're going to transform, the entire process of customer service or whatever it happens to be. I think you want to cut your teeth and figure out how to use AI and work with AI and get some capability built up within the company by picking off a few relatively easier, use cases that may be a bit more isolated. But totally agree, if you are going to really get the benefit out of AI, you need to take a step back and think about, how am I going to rethink, rework a particular process from end to end, and how could AI make that, very different? And that's the only way you'll get full benefit. Totally agree.
Yeah. So while the potential for change and increased productivity looks fabulous, we also talked, I think coming back to the purpose of your book was to talk about the potential harm and missteps that organizations could take and how to prevent those. Do you think companies are thinking about this issue in the way that they should? I know that many companies are proactively establishing principles, guardrails, and offering some kind of disclosure on how they build or use AI. I know that Accenture has published many of its guidelines and processes. Similarly, I've seen Google and people like Anthropic and Google and others, some better, some are better than others maybe. But essentially, some of these initiatives even might go beyond what is expected by the regulatory environment, right? Because maybe the regulatory environment is playing a bit catch up in some of these areas because they don't know what this technology can do. So are companies doing enough to self-regulate? And can we afford to take a hands-off approach from a public policy standpoint?
So I think this is the nub of the question for me. And again, one of the reasons we wrote the book in a sense was that we saw very much a need for companies to self-regulate. I think it's improving. I think we've moved, for many companies, we're moving beyond having some principles and publishing, some information to actually thinking about, well, how do I implement these principles? Because most people in an organization, let's face it, they don't read principles and they don't read policies. You need processes that force people to do what they're supposed to do in many cases, right? And that is what companies are increasingly starting to set up, a governance process which has a workflow and will control and make sure that AI is used in the right way. And I think companies are doing that, and organizations generally are doing that ahead of regulation in most cases. As you said, the regulation is quite variable depending on where you are geographically and what sector you're in and so on. But I think fundamentally, most companies want to do the right thing. They don't want to be the one that's in a news headline because their AI went wrong in one of a number of different ways. And so I think there is an increasing recognition of the need for self-governance, and it's encouraging to see that.
Okay. So, but it's also one thing I noticed when we were preparing our State of AI Governance report last year, was that while many companies had some principles and guidelines and even published ones about what they do and what they don't, there weren't any reporting on their efforts. Like, what had they done? What did they find out? What were the missteps that were noticed? What did they do to sort of address them? And there's also, is it all very meaningful? Then is it possible to even imagine that they might allow or some external scrutiny into their processes to make sure that they're doing something which is truly harmful?
So there's a few interesting thoughts here. So I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if there was some regulation which required people to publish more about incidents and things like this that have happened. And in fact, the US has a very mixed regulatory regime when it comes to AI, mostly driven by the individual states. And I know in the last few days, New York State has approved legislation which I think will introduce more transparency requirements. I haven't had a chance yet to read the detail, but from what I understand, it will introduce more transparency requirements on companies to publish results about the types of tests that they do on AI, incidents that occur and this sort of thing. And that can only be good in my view, because apart from anything else, it shares information then with others so that they can learn from that. And it might be valuable to pool some of this information in an institute or a government body or whatever, or academia, to try and learn from that. So that I think would be a step forward without doubt. You talk also about or implying the concept of AI assurance, third-party assurance. And that's something that certainly in the UK, the government is pushing quite hard. The idea that we should have an ecosystem of third-party companies that provide testing services basically for AI. And I think that's something that has a lot of merit, because going back to a comment you made very much earlier in this conversation, people trust things typically that they understand. And if they can't understand it themselves, they don't have the technical capability to understand it, the way they tend to build trust is because they trust somebody else who they trust, who understands it, right? Some technical expert who has a qualification, a certification to say they are able to carry out tests on AI, and they publish a test certificate. That's how we trust electrical appliances. They go to a government institute or whatever, they get tested and they have a little symbol on them, and then we know we're not going to get electrocuted when we plug in the iron or whatever. And I think something like that for the AI world would be very handy. It wouldn't necessarily be required, not to begin with, but companies, I think many would naturally turn to this third-party assurance, because by providing that certificate, they would actually open up a bigger market for themselves, because customers would look at it and say, hey, okay, we trust you because you've got this third-party company that says that your AI is going to do what we think it is.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with you. I think sometimes some of these things may not even be, it's not necessary that they be mandatory, but it will help signal to your customer base that you're a more trustworthy company, because you're sharing that information, you're being transparent, and you have been open to a third-party assessment and have done so. And it's not necessary for the world to come up with something new. Really, when I think about it, I say, hey, look at all the medicines that we we use. First of all, they go through a series of tests and they go through
Mhm.
phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. There are there's a huge army of people who do clinical data management, who analyze the data, figure out if the drug is
Mhm.
effective and safe, and then get it approved by like an authority like the FDA or so on, who says that yes,
Yes,
this drug has demonstrated that it's got a certain amount of efficacy and it's also safe. Right. At the same time, you also, even after it's been deployed, you have something called pharmacovigilance, which is used in the drug industry, where they have to report any adverse events. So if somebody has taken your medicine and had a reaction which was not expected, then they have to report it within like a
exactly.
very short period of time. And then then you have a bunch of doctors who will analyze it, figure out, is it because of other medication that this patient might have been taking, or is it this particular drug that caused that adverse effect? So I think a system which is not so different from that could probably work in this space as well.
I agree.
Yeah. So coming back to it, I think you talked about the US and the changing legislations which are happening there. And one very interesting thing that I noticed over the last 1 year, and you tell me whether you sort of also notice it, that you said that the US is now coming up with more regulations around reporting requirements, around what companies should do to govern better and so on, and how data should be managed and all those areas. While the EU and the US historically has been biased towards innovation rather than regulation, while the EU has been saying that, I'd rather have less innovation, but I want to make sure that nothing really goes dramatically wrong. Right. So there's been more regulation. There's a regulation bias, and there's an innovation bias. But I also noticed during the last year that the EU is sort of opening up a bit more, and becoming a little more in favor of innovation, and taking cautious steps towards opening it up. While the US seems to be thinking that, hey, maybe we've let go too much, and we need to sort of hunker down and be more careful. Is that your observation as well?
I think in the case of the US, it's a bit of it's somewhat torn. So I think that at the state level in the US, there is a recognition that we need more regulation, and it is coming through. I read that every single state in the US has published some kind of AI regulations in 2025. They're different and they're not all very far-reaching, etc. California and New York State are the two that are really pushing ahead and regulating most. But at the federal level, there is a pushback against regulation. In fact, President Trump signed an executive order just a week ago, essentially banning the states from introducing AI legislation. Now, it remains to be seen whether the courts uphold that or not, because my understanding is he's not allowed to do that, but we shall see where that goes. So the US is still a bit, split in its view on what should happen with regulation and legislation. Europe, as you say, has proposed that it may relax some of its EU AI Act. Now, I think a couple of observations on that. One is that may partly have been due to pressure from Trump and US technology companies and so on, but also within Europe itself, a large number of businesses in Europe put forward a petition to the EU to relax the laws, saying that it would disadvantage them. And the Mario Draghi report from 2024 also said that there was a risk that the legislation would be too onerous. So I think there is a chance that the EU will water down its legislation, but it's only been a proposal so far. It has to go through a lot of different hurdles before it's passed. It's not clear whether those changes will actually come into effect. I think I'm still seeing, with companies that I talk to, including US companies, I'm still seeing quite a few multinationals saying, you know what, it's very difficult for us to have different standards in different parts of the world or in different states in the US. So what we are going to do is we're going to take the most difficult, the most tough set of rules, and we're going to design our governance program to match those rules. And then we may make changes by exception. So if a particular geographic business unit comes forward and says, hey, we don't have to comply with this particular aspect in our country or state or whatever, and we think there's a valid business reason why we shouldn't, then they will authorize exceptions on that basis. But the starting point would be one consistent framework applied globally.
Yeah, do you see the future? I like that approach that you start off with something which is the most stringent, try to comply to that, and then relax a little bit here and there based on the assessment of the law and the business imperative, right?
Yep.
But do you see a case for a global standard? Do you think something like that would emerge?
Yes.
I know that there is this ISO 42001, which talks about requirements for an AI risk management system. But do you see a global standard eventually emerging, which everybody would follow, or do you think that this would be something that it's going to continue to, because of this competition and each one wanting to try and get more AI into their own countries might compete with more lax regulatory environment in order to encourage AI development and AI supremacy? What do you think is the future?
Well, I think it would be good if there were one global AI standard that were universally applied. I think there's little doubt in my mind that that would be a positive step forward. I don't think that's going to happen.
Yes.
I do think still there is value in having a set of standards which can be applied globally. So something like the ISO standard, I think it's very valuable, and other standards like that. It's helpful to have a common language across different countries or companies that wish to set a particular standard. And if we go back to our point about third-party assurance that we talked about before, if you're going to provide certification or assurance, you have to certify against something, against some kind of best practice standard. So again, having something like an ISO 4201 or 4205, etc., that you can assure against is a very valuable benchmark to have. So I think, we will see more of those standards emerging. Will they be required by law everywhere in the world? No. It would be great if they were. But even in the absence of that, companies and some countries can rely on them, which is a positive move.
Thank you very much, Ray. That was quite comprehensive in terms of understanding the whole landscape of AI governance, what are countries doing, what companies are doing, and what we should be hoping for. Same time, I know we are at the end of the year, and this episode will probably be published towards the end of this year or early in January. So what are your predictions for 2026?
Well, I think 2026 will be the year that we see AI agents starting to emerge more strongly. There was a lot of talk about agents in the second half of 2025. I think there will be even more talk about AI agents in 2026, and we will start to see some organizations really implementing. I mean, we already have a few organizations that are implementing, but not very many. And there's also a question of definition about what an AI agent really is. How much autonomy does it really have? How much scope does it have? But I think 2026 will be the year when we start to see many more companies and organizations really experimenting with implementing AI agents in the first proper use cases. I don't think that they will be mainstream in all companies and what have you by the end of the year. By no means. Adoption tends to be much slower than we think. Adoption's a hard bit, right? It's the implementation, it's the changing the hearts and minds, it's getting people to trust, it's changing the business processes. All of that takes a lot longer than the pure tech piece, as you said yourself. Yeah. Digital transformation, easy. The tech bit was the easy bit. The hard bit was changing everything that needed to change to make it work. And that will take time. But I think AI agents will be the big flavor of 2026.
And in terms of AI governance, do you see roles like the chief responsible AI officer becoming more ubiquitous?
Possibly not, actually. And that may sound counterintuitive to what you would expect me to say. But actually, the trend that I'm seeing is more and more companies incorporating AI governance into their overall governance. So rather than having a separate person who is the chief responsible AI officer, I see companies merging AI governance into data governance and other compliance requirements, data privacy and data and so on. And so I think it will be embedded into broader compliance and governance programs, and you won't have a need necessarily for a chief responsible AI officer. You may well have a chief data and AI officer. That role is proliferating because AI is becoming so important strategically for companies. And very often that chief AI officer or data and AI officer will be the person who is also accountable for the responsible use of the AI. Because coming back to something I said earlier, for me, AI governance is just about making sure that AI does what you want it to do and doesn't go wrong. And so therefore, if you're the person who's in charge of using data and AI, you're also in charge of making sure it actually delivers on its desired objectives. So I think that's the route we'll see, more than dedicated chief responsible AI officers.
So thank you very much, Ray. It was a pleasure talking to you. So season's greetings and wish you a happy new year.
Thank you very much, Sridhar. It was such a pleasure to catch up again, and thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and the same best wishes to you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.